Welcome to News24 Frontline. It is Friday, the 14th of February, Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day to all our viewers and to my guests on today's show. But we're not here to talk about love today, quite the contrary. It's been an eventful week in the Republic of South Africa with a lot of debate. Issued by President of the United States, Donald Trump. And in his order, he wrote the following: while championing terrorism and autocratic regimes abroad, South Africa has committed similar human rights violations at home. The recent Expropriation Act enables the government of South Africa to seize ethnic minority descendants of settler groups as agricultural property without compensation. The Expropriation Act follows countless government policies designed to dismantle equal opportunity in employment, education, and business, and hateful rhetoric and government actions fueling disproportionate violence against racially disfavored landowners. Years ago, the South African government disbanded volunteer forces defending rural farmers, turning a blind eye to the ensuing farm attacks. And this is not a bad dream. This is just some of the words from US President Donald Trump's executive order when he announced that the US would cut all funding to South Africa a week ago. The US, of course, is one of South Africa's biggest trading partners, and it would be a catastrophe to our economy if sanctions are put in place or if higher tariffs are levied on our exports. This executive order has caused the biggest diplomatic crisis between the USA and South Africa in more than 70 years. The last time anything vaguely like this happened was when the US instituted sanctions against the apartheid state. My name is Adrian Basson. I'm the editor-in-chief of News24. And it's my honor to lead this frontline discussion, Land, Lies, and Trump, today from the headquarters of Media24 in Cape Town. I'm joined today by 5 eminent guests who will help News24 readers understand this matter better. Firstly, Advocate Tembeka Ngugai-Qobi, Advocate of the High Court of South Africa, legal scholar and author of the book Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. We're also joined today by Mr. Willie Oukamp, spokesperson for the Democratic Alliance, Carol Payton, writer-at-large for News24 Business, Johan Kotze, the CEO of South Africa's largest organization of commercial farmers, Agri SA, as well as Jack Will Ferris, a director of law firm Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, where he heads up industrials, manufacturing, and trade. Johan, I would like to start with you. You and Agri SA represent the majority of organized farmers or agriculturists in South Africa. It must have been a very busy week over at Agri SA. Can you tell us what has been the response from your members, from real South African farmers, in the wake of this very dramatic announcement by Trump?
I think the first thing is it was a bumpy week, that I can assure you, a very emotional week. And in the sense of, I think what happened to us kind of polarized for a start of the week, polarized the South African farming community. And I think the reason for that is it was so based on political issues, and we're actually just farmers. So I think throughout the week, and I think a lot of work has been done through us and various other people in our industry itself, I think the reality for the South African farmers is a trade issue. So that would be the first consent for us, is to say that for us as South African farmers, what happened and what came out of America is a threat to us on the trade concept that we have. As you know, 50% of what we produce, we export, so which is quite a big chunk in this whole concept. And America is a very strategic market for us. Seasonal wise, we in season when they're not in season, so there's a big play for us into that. And just out of a marketing perspective, specifically, let's say avos, there's a big focus for us. Citrus, there's a big focus for us into the US. So out of a trading perspective, it's a concern for us. To get back to the first one is, I think the concern is also the polarization amongst local farmers. And I think it's politics and not farming itself. That is politics honing into us, and all of a sudden there's a focus again on white and on Afrikaans. And I think we kind of got out of that spec for quite a while, but the spotlights are on again, and it feels like, yes, so why are we polarizing and getting back into it? So that would be my two cents for the start, and the two issues I think that we were experiencing the week after America said, listen, there's going to be an issue on trade.
Johan, if I can just, as a follow-up question, ask you, and just as a reminder to our subscribers who are locked into this call, you're welcome to pose your questions in the chat box, which we will try and put to our panelists. Johan, President Trump has now opened up refugee status for Afrikaner farmers. Have you heard of any South African farmer who wants to take up that refugee status? I mean, is that even an issue that's being discussed in your organization?
So we had a provincial meeting where we pulled all our provinces into a session this week. Well, I can tell you the good news about the South Africans, we're good at making jokes about something that is tough. So we had a few good laughs and few good jokes. It would be difficult for somebody being in South Africa, a farmer with land and with a business, to go to America. So I think the first thing we said to ourselves is, you're going to battle to get established people moving to America. And that doesn't, for us, it doesn't hold us back to say that none of the farmers are going to go. But we didn't put that up as an issue for us as Agri-SA and farmers that we need to address, that people want to go and take up the promise that was made. So our personal take is, you're going to get farmers going, and we don't blame people going, but it's not going to be the core of the South African farming community that's going to go, and we're going to kind of be left without some of our world-class farmers that's going to move to America. So we didn't put that up as a great concern for us as Agri-SA in South Africa.
Tembeka, if I can move to you, you have written quite extensively about the Expropriation Act. Of course, it is not a new act. It's been on the law book since 1975. It's just been amended now. But that act is at the center of the uproar, or one of the key issues that's led to this situation. And then, as you pointed out in your article yesterday, the real issue of dispute is Section 12.3, which allows the state to offer nil compensation in some instances. Can you maybe just give our readers and our viewers a background on the matter of nil compensation and why it was introduced into this act?
The shorter, there's obviously the larger background of land dispossession, but we don't have the time this afternoon to talk about that. But the shorter legislative background is in 2013, when the EFF was established. It set one of its cardinal pillars as expropriation of land without compensation. And at that point, except for the ANC Youth League, that idea hadn't germinated within the broader liberation movement. Until 2017, at the ANC conference, where a resolution was passed, much to the astonishment of many, that the Constitution ought to be considered for an amendment in order to make provision for expropriation of land without compensation, provided that doing so will not harm the investor sentiment in the country. In the following year, 2018, the ANC had not, in fact, taken measures to introduce any law to amend Section 25, and the EFF placed a constitutional amendment proposal to Parliament. In principle, it was adopted, although there were several qualifications. That resulted in approximately 12 months of public hearings on the desirability of the amendment to Section 25. The argument being that Section 25 is a constraint to land reform, and if you want to do a faster land reform, you have to remove the obstacle, which was Section 25. Of course, the argument was false. Section 25 has never been a constraint to land reform. There have been other factors, but it was politically convenient to do that. Alongside that, then came an amendment to the bill. The bill itself comes from 2007. I was actually one of the drafters of the 2007 expropriation bill, which was abandoned by the ANC in 2009. What they then did in the current version of the bill is that entire constitutional amendment process was then reduced into legislative reform, which is what some of us have always been arguing, that you can achieve instances of nil compensation through a legislative device. You don't need to do away with Section 25 of the Constitution. But in doing so, they did it in a very smart way, in the way they amended the Expropriation Act, because they retained the structure of Section 25, which is there is no entitlement to market value. Only the courts can decide, and the test is whether it is just and equitable. And what Section 12, subsection 3 expands on when it would be just and equitable for a judge to order that nil compensation would be appropriate. And then it sets out the 4 exemplars of when it would be appropriate, but those exemplars are not confined. It could be wider than that, it could be narrower than that. But the question in each case is, when will a court decide that it is just and equitable to offer nil compensation? There are still obviously 2 important factors there to remember. Firstly, it's false for people to say the state will seize land without compensation. It's totally false. The state has no power to seize land without compensation. Number 2, the section entrenches the rule of law. Only judges may decide whether or not a piece of ground should be taken with no compensation. And even there, the discretion of the judges is severely constrained by law.
Thank you, Tembeka. Jackwell, I want to bring you in. You've also written extensively on the Expropriations Act, and the piece that I found, that our readers can find online on the website of CDH is titled "Don't Be Alarmed by the Expropriation Act." I would like for you to also just elaborate on why, from a legal point of view, you argue that investors and property owners, including farmers, should not be alarmed by the act. Of course, Mr. Trump do not agree with you. Many of his supporters in South Africa also don't agree with you. Why just from a pure legal perspective, do you hold that view?
Thank you, Adrian. From a pure legal perspective, what we do is, just as a law firm, we actually advise the clients and particularly investors on a daily basis in respect of the risk to the investment, whether in respect of unfair treatment or in respect of the potential risk of expropriation. We've done this for myself personally for the past more than 10 years almost in respect of this particular issue. And this particular issue also culminates in the number of policy changes that South Africa has done in relation to bilateral investment treaties, and also the termination of those treaties and the ultimate protection that's provided for investors. Now, when I talk about investors, I now talk about foreign investors that actually have invested in South Africa, and also part of that investment are typically in major infrastructure projects, whether it's energy, water, sanitation, or other telecommunications, and the risk of those investments becoming subject to expropriation. And so our analysis in respect of the Expropriation Act as it is, and I think Tembekile has clearly articulated also what the position is that if you look at it, fundamentally, we have the 1975 Act, which is still law today because the 2024 Act has not yet come into effect, although it was gazetted in January. It aligns to the Constitution. It aligns to the principles set out in the Constitution in terms of there's a general law of application. It introduces an additional concept, which is in the Constitution, which is not just expropriation in the public purpose, but also in the public interest. And there's a specific definition of that set out in the Constitution, but now specifically also in the Expropriation Act. It also sets out an elaborate process in terms of what the state actually needs to do. So it's a much more cumbersome process, bar now the discussion about compensation, but it's a very cumbersome process for the state to actually expropriate either in the public purpose or in the public interest. So there's an investigation process the state needs to go through in terms of identifying property or land that needs to be expropriated. There must be specific the state needs to set out specific reasons why it has identified this particular land for expropriation. So there's numerous processes that a party affected by the actor or the state's decision to expropriate could challenge it. And that's just the process in deciding and ultimately issuing a notice of expropriation. So you could take the state on review. So it's much more cumbersome than the current act. And that obviously also fulfills the constitutional obligation of the state, which says that if the state makes certain decision, which is against your right, administrative decisions, you can challenge that judicially. It's the same for the compensation element. We are of the view that it's very narrow circumstances. It's within the confines of what the Constitution ultimately contemplates. And as the advocate has indicated, it is ultimately only subject to what a court will determine that whether there should be no compensation or not. There's only international debates around these issues. And the fundamental principle in international law, what we call customary international law, is there's 4 fundamental principles that an act of expropriation must comply with. So maybe the first principle is also to say that all states, whether South Africa, any state, including the US, has the inherent right to expropriate in its jurisdiction. One of those elements, which is of the contentious, is customary international law makes provision for there must be compensation. But if you look at our constitution, what it also provides is in terms of section, I think it's 232, it says, to the extent that customary international law is inconsistent with our constitution or act of parliament, obviously our constitution will override. So, and within the confines again of section 25, we can find that there are circumstances and very exceptional circumstances where the state would be able to do so. And that has been articulated to some extent in section 12, and if it's not a closed list. So broadly, that's our answer why there should not be really fear-mongering in respect of that the state will just confiscate land and state is confiscating land on a grand scale. That is actually not factual. And it's actually very cumbersome for the state to expropriate land. We have first-hand experience because we act for also state-owned entities that are busy with major infrastructure projects where they need to expropriate. And to do that, it takes them years to actually expropriate in the public purpose for major infrastructure projects also. And one of those might even be in the context of what we're doing from an energy perspective, where transmission lines are required to ensure that the country has access to stable grid. But that's only under the concept of public purpose. But yeah.
Jackal, thank you very much. Willie Oukamp, we've now heard from the lawyers. Both lawyers on the call says no reason to lose sleepless nights. Your party, the Democratic Alliance, has gone to court this week. You filed papers to challenge this act. Can you tell us why are you challenging this act and on which grounds are you challenging the act?
Adrian, yeah, thank you. I think it's very important to firstly look at the history and the background. The Democratic Alliance was pivotal in the prevention of the changes that the ANC wanted to make to Section 25 of the Constitution. You'll remember that they could not fulfill their wishes to change that. And after that, the ANC came with this bill and they tried to, before it was an act, And in a certain sense, they try to keep face with the electorate, and they use this bill to make changes, to make provision for the phrases expropriation without compensation. Whether it's without compensation or no compensation, they wanted to have something to tell their electorate that, look, we are going to do this. And that should not be the object of this. We've got to adhere to the Constitution. I've heard what the two legal experts there said, but we, from our side, we've also got our legal experts. I studied law myself, and I went through the bill. And I can tell you now, if you go through, well, the Act now, if you go through that, there's a lot of vagueness. There's a lot of things that does not talk to each other. If you compare Clause 8 or Section 8 of the Act with Section 19, where the one section says that before expropriation can take place, there must be a notice of expropriation and also an amount agreed upon. And if you can't agree to that amount, then you can go to court, and then the expropriation notice can be sent. Whereas Section 19 of the Act makes it totally different. Section 19 speaks of something else than Section 8 is speaking about. And you cannot have confusion like that in a specific act. Secondly, let me give you a few examples. We must remember, Adrian, that we are now going to be working with officials in municipal level as well as provincial level. We do not know what they're going to do. This act says that when expropriation takes place, there must be negotiations between the expropriating body, which is government, as well as the landowner or property owner. So that is fine. There must be negotiations taking place. But then it goes further and it says that should those negotiations not be successful, then the expropriating authority can expropriate land or property without compensation. Now, that should not be. It's unfair. Any property owner that's going to go into negotiations with the state, with government, on a specific property that they want to expropriate, does so with a gun against his or her head, because they know that if they do not agree with the offer that the state is putting to them, whether that offer is fair or not, that's not the question now. But if I do not agree with that offer, then the state can come and they can expropriate me without compensating me, and the onus is on me, and I've got to go through a lot of legal and costly legal exercises to protect my rights. It should not be. There's another clause. Let me give you another example that says that even in instances where an amount has been agreed upon, the non-payment of that amount does not halt the transfer of the rights of the property. So you can have an instance where the amount has been agreed, the property has been transferred, and now the expropriating authority is not paying the landowner or property owner. The fact that he's not getting paid, whether it's 1 week, 1 year, or 10 years, does not stop the transfer of that property. So he does not have his property anymore. He does not have money in his pocket. That is expropriation without compensation and just making it extremely difficult. So things like that cannot happen. The other leg, Adrian, that we base our legal challenge to this act on is the procedural processes that were very lacking, especially in the NCOP. When you look at the NCOP and the inner workings of the NCOP, there must be final mandates that's given by the provinces. You first get your negotiating mandates and then the final mandate. And those mandates need to be approved in a sitting, in a plenary of those provincial legislatures. The Democratic Alliance, via the Western Cape that we govern, voted to oppose this act. The Northwest Province did not have any mandate at all. So of the 7 remaining provinces, 5 of those provinces' procedures were done totally incorrectly. They did not get final mandates from the legislature. A letter from the speaker saying that there has been a plenary where it did not happen is not sufficient. So it is procedurally on that fact. And then with regards to the subject matter of the bill itself, the Democratic Alliance is of opinion that this act is really trampling on the constitutional rights of a lot of people. I also want to just carry on with what Johan said there, and that is that with what happened with Donald Trump and what has been said in the last week or so in South Africa, it does polarize us. We are working extremely hard in this country to move away from racial profiling, racial polarization. We don't want that. The Democratic Alliance, for one, is working extremely hard to do that. And I know such a lot of other organizations as well. And we tend to only talk about what Trump does and whether President Trump is fueling these racial dimensions in our country, whereas we must look at what these acts does. If a property owner sees that this is the rights of himself that might be trampled upon, and the vagueness of this, it puts them in lagers, which we must not do. We must prevent this. And from the Democratic Alliance side, we will always do everything in our power to grow this economy and to create jobs in this country. And to have polarization like that and have insecurities like this will not help. The signing of this act, Adrian, will definitely not enhance investor confidence into this country. We've proposed that the act be referred back. And just one last thing, Adrian, the Minister of Public Works obtained a legal opinion that he provided to the President, which said there are certain constitutionality issues. Please refer this back to the National Assembly so that we can renegotiate it and see what's carrying on there. And the President chose to not listen to that. And that, I believe, was a mistake.
Thank you very much. Carol Payton, my colleague Carol Payton, our writer at large, I want to get to you next. Carol, $1 million question. Why did Trump do this? Why did he act so harshly? Why are we so important to him when he's got many other issues to deal with? And what does he want from South Africa?
Yeah, I think that the US, in particular, the MAGA movement, has been annoyed with South Africa for quite a long time. And we saw that, over the Lady Russia, the Lady R thing, the boat, the dispute over whether arms were loaded on or off that boat. And we know we had a sort of flurry of diplomacy to try and persuade the US that, no, actually, we are really, really non-aligned. And I think that a lot of the things South Africa's done in its foreign policy, such as just being part of the BRICS, wanting friendly relationships, especially with China, but also with Russia, the joining Iran joining the BRICS most recently. I think all of those things have really disturbed the US, and who like to have a country like South Africa within their kind of sphere of influence, and they didn't feel that was the case with South Africa. And I think for some time, Trump's been looking for, or let's say the MAGA movement has been looking for, how can we actually punish South Africa for being friends with our enemies? So that's basically the issue. And I think that it just so happened that Trump has been concerned about the expropriation bill. He was lobbied on it previously when he was previously president. He was lobbied by sort of white rights groups. And so he's been aware of it. And then this just happened to sort of be signed at the same time as Trump was coming into office. So it was a great excuse. And I mean, the way they have pumped it up, saying that they're going to provide humanitarian support to Afrikaner farmers and that sort of language and that sort of message has been highly populist and completely inaccurate, as we found once he offered refugee status to Afrikaans farmers and to AfriForum and so on. They said, well, no, actually, we don't want to go. We want to be here, which is correct. And, the president did respond correctly, I think, saying, there's no need for Afrikaners to leave the land of their birth. That's not the issue here. But I think at the root of it, they don't want us to be friends with their enemies.
Carol, how strong do you think the Expropriation Act issue has weighed on Trump doing this, or do you think it's really more about the two other issues mentioned in his executive order, which is firstly South Africa's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, and secondly our relationships with Iran? I must say, completely unconfirmed. There's no evidence that South Africa takes money from Iran or that we're helping them with a nuclear program. But I mean, Donald Trump believes it, and he's put it in an executive order.
Yes, no, exactly. I should have mentioned that in the first place. I mean, I think the case at the ICJ has really antagonized many in America, and obviously antagonized the Jewish Israeli lobby, which is very powerful in Washington. So I do think that, you know, that those are the issues. The issue is not really the Expropriation Act. I mean, why would he really? It's inconsequential to the US, to the world, to everybody else, except for us here who are dealing with our own sort of domestic issues. So I don't think the Expropriation Act is a big issue for Trump and MAGA at all. I mean, it does fit. Sorry, I should just say it does obviously fit with their ideology. They're kind of the ideology that they're now trying to export to the rest of the world, which is that, you know, we've got to kill the woke mind virus, and the reaction to the kind of whole woke liberal ideology that dominated American society for the last while. So yeah, it suits him there, but I don't think it's a material issue that they would need to, you know, take extreme steps against a country for that like they have done.
Yeah, Johan Coates, the CEO of AgriSA. I want to come back to you. So we don't have time today here to unpack the entire agriculture landscape, but my understanding is very much that agriculture, and specifically organized agriculture, the big farmers in South Africa, the big food producers, are organized provincially or per region. And that these associations or unions that these farmers in, for example, the Northern Cape or the Western Cape or the north of the country belong to, that they are by far affiliated to AgriSA, and that AgriSA is the organization that can talk on behalf of farmers. I want to be very blunt and ask you, how has the likes of AfriForum and Solidarity and their affiliated organization, SAI, how have they succeeded in almost becoming the voice of Afrikaners or the voice of white farmers on an international stage, even into the White House, to the extent that you know, an organization like that does not represent the majority of farmers in South Africa could convince the president of the richest and most powerful country on earth to issue these kind of false statements?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, and I think Carol mentioned it wasn't really them going there and did the stir come from them, or is it kind of we scored a goal here, or our own goal, or somebody else scored a goal and they claimed the goal? I don't know. Maybe just on structure-wise and the way it was claimed, I think the Expropriation Act itself is for every farmer, it is a concern. And you get a concern where people are less concerned and where people go for the Zimbabwean scenario. So it's so far, and that's with our own constituency exactly the same. I think that the take on your question is, firstly, about agriculture in South Africa, and specifically AgriSA. We're 120 years old, and we are presented in every province, which is a significant thing for agriculture because of the diversity of agriculture and also the complexity of agriculture. And the way that we work is you work from the bottom upwards to the top. Now, to get back to the question on how would they be able to go and portray themselves as the largest, I would say, or representing the majority of South African farmers, I think AgriSA has always took the stance of taking middle ground and be rational in the way that we think. So even amongst our own constituency, you're going to have both poles. But eventually you bring it back, and the system, the mechanism of how we organize ourselves normally comes back to a point where you get fluent up to you get to the middle ground again. And what I've seen in life is, and to a certain extent that's also controversial in our politics, that sometimes the noise is on the radical sides. And the ones not making the noise is to a certain extent the ones not being heard that much. And then it seems like, but you have this noise and they act on behalf of all the farmers. My take would be the different stance, and I think that's what we did with the opinion. Adrian, I don't want to vouch for Agri-SA in South Africa. We stood up and said, but there's a different picture for agriculture in South Africa. And how does this picture look like? And that's why I wrote the opinion piece where we said, but we don't see the farm evasions. We don't see expropriation without compensation. And then a better story came out this week to show the good story of agriculture for the past 30 years. So, and I agree to what Willie is saying. I think for so long, we stepped out of this narrative of being polarized. And we don't talk about white commercial Afrikaans-speaking farmers anymore. For a long time, we talk about farmers in South Africa. We talk about small-scale and commercial farmers. So a long end to your question is, sometimes it's a pity that when you take the middle ground and you stand for the greater and you're not radical in your stance, you're not heard that much. And you not often go to all the podiums to stand up and put a flag up. I think the biggest flag this week that went up is the good news of what happened about South Africa, with agriculture in South Africa the past 30 years. And just one comment. We grew the export market for our produce by 6-fold. That is a story in my mind that should shout much louder than any political party, any stance of any organized agriculture body, because it's about agriculture in South Africa.
Thanks, Johan. The center, the middle ground is silent. And I mean, I think that's something that we all need to address going into the next 4 years under Trump, because it cannot be. Willie, I'll get to you after Tembeka. I do want to bring in Tembeka on the legal points again. Tembeka, I found it quite curious that the DA has not attacked the null compensation issue in their court case. I mean, Willie has explained their take on it, and from he kind of his colleague Helen Ziller also speaks about null compensation, but actually when they went to court, they're not challenging that matter. Can you maybe tell us, just from your perspective, why do you think, as a lawyer, that challenge wouldn't succeed? Why it wouldn't actually work, and why the null compensation is in the act, and why they're not challenging it?
Well, I think that the problem with a possible challenge to null compensation is that it's adding nothing to the structure of the Constitution. What it is doing, it's simply expanding what the concept of justice and equity might mean in certain circumstances. You could have got exactly the same provision, Section 12.3, written by a judge, who would say, I find on the facts in front of me that nil compensation is warranted. So it was a stillborn idea that you could challenge that particular provision, because it's such a narrow provision, and what it simply does is to unpack Section 25 in particular instances. So it was very unlikely to succeed. But there is, of course, a problem with the discussion today from the DA. In them saying, well, one of their problems is that the Act allows expropriation before the determination of compensation. You see, this is a problem we have in South Africa. That framing comes from the 1975 Act, which splits the Act of expropriation from the Act of the determination of compensation, doesn't combine them. It was confirmed by the Constitutional Court in a case called Haffajee. So it's again part and parcel of this sort of make-believe stories about this Expropriation Act. It's not introduced by the ANC government that you must split the two. It was introduced by the Nationalist Party government. Why? Because when the nationalists wanted to expropriate land in 1975 in order to create Bantustans, they did not want the delays inherent in an expropriation. And that's why they said the moment of vesting should be split from the moment of the determination of compensation. Now, your listeners are being told by the DA something that is just not in the act, that the ANC has introduced XYZ. So, and again, I can go on and on. So it's actually quite frustrating when you hear this level of misrepresentation. What we are not discussing, Adrian, is we are discussing the sort of white fears and farmer fears, property owner fears. What we are not discussing are the expectations of African people when they hear us talking about an Expropriation Act. They think that finally the aspirations of freedom are going to be met. But we know this Expropriation Act is not going to be because it is a diversion from the real work of land reform that should be done. Even the noise around it is a diversionary noise from the work that we must do to fulfill the Constitution. Even today, we are spending 45 minutes, the bulk of which is spent on white fears. When are we actually going to discuss how are we going to implement the Constitution in a way that responds to the aspirations of African people?
Thanks for that, Tembeka. Jackwell, I want to come to you around this matter of land reform and the fact that the promise of the Constitution has not happened. I don't know if this is in your area of expertise, but we've also seen some questions coming through on the line today to say, is there an update on how successful or not government's land reform project has been? And if it has not been, what is government doing about it to get better in that space?
Yeah, John, thank you. Not specifically, so I don't really deal with land reform issues in particular, but from a constitutional perspective and from what has happened over the past 30 years, we know that the program of land reform has not really been effective for various reasons. Also from a government perspective in terms of how the legislation has been implemented, and obviously there's also been rumors of corruption in the process, and also delays from actually finalizing the amount of compensation, because it's a willing buyer, willing seller ultimately process, and that goes back to the 1975 Act. And this actually allows a bit more leeway for the state in respect of how to, if under specific circumstances, you can expropriate, where the compensation amount is just and equitable, and in some instances subject to the assessment that needs to be done at no compensation. But I'm not an expert on land reform, and I don't purport to be so.
Jackwell, just a last question to you. We've got some questions coming through on the line around the issue of property. So people are asking about the word property in the Expropriation Act. Does that only refer to land, or does it also refer to any asset or movable property? What is your understanding of that?
Yeah, so the concept property in Section 25 and in the Expropriation Act is the broad sense of property. So it's not just physical land, but also property in the more broader sense, incorporeal property, anything that will ultimately constitute property rights. So share any other form of unregistered rights that are also considered as property rights. And then specifically when we talk about the no compensation aspect, that's where it specifically refers to land in Section 12. But the property concept is much more broader than just land.
I just want to get this clear while we have the benefit of having you. So the issue of no compensation only applies to land. It doesn't apply to property, because I have seen questions coming through around, and again, the fears that Tembeka speak about, people fearing that there may now be, compensation of, expropriation of vehicles or a business or anything that's not necessarily only land. Yeah.
No, that's not contemplated by, and Tembeka, you can confirm that's not contemplated by Section 12. It's specifically, and again, there's a number of requirements to comply with, but just, equitable, in the public interest in respect of land reform, and specific to land, and then there's all those four specific instances, which is not a closed list. One of them is if the property is not being used and the specific owner is not using that for the generation of income, and a number of other factors, or where the state is the owner of the property and it's not being used, and so on. So it's a closed list, but not a closed list, but there's specific guidelines in respect of when that will be applicable.
Willie, I want to bring you back. There's been a few comments that I'd like you to respond to. You can respond to any of them, but I specifically want you to just comment on Tembeka's views that you're misrepresenting the specific issue around when the land can be expropriated or until a decision about money has been made, and that goes back to the Bantustan's issue. And then also, I want you to also just maybe explain a bit more why you're not challenging the issue of null compensation in your case.
Well, Adrian, okay, firstly, I would like to react to, I've read the questions. It is very important to notice that the Democratic Alliance has never promoted or protected this act. We have said that this act does not override Section 25 of the Constitution, which it does not. No act does. Whilst all the wind were blowing last week over this whole thing, the Democratic Alliance was carrying on with the drafting of our court papers, which was already filed last week, Friday. So the Democratic Alliance never supported or came in protection of this specific act. I'm not going to go through the whole discrepancies between Clause 8 or Section 8 and Section 19 of the Act. Again, I discussed that earlier on, and that is now in the courts due to our court papers that we filed and for the courts to decide. I would like to come back, however, with the question that you asked, Johan, with regards to AfriForum and Solidariteit and SAI, etc. I think it is not correct of anybody to try to lay this in front of any organization in South Africa, whether it's AfriForum or SAI or Agri-SA or the DA, whoever. The actions from the United States of America and President Trump must surely be put in front of the foot of the ANC. It is the ANC that has, over the years, expected the United States of America to assist with aid and to assist with trade. But every single time that the ANC government had an option to promote the United States' interest in the international sphere, they went the wrong way. The whole discussion around whether Iran gave the ANC money or not, that's not on the table now. But we know that the South African government promoted Iran to become a part of BRICS. The United States is a sworn enemy of Iran. And in various other instances, we chose to align ourselves with the scoundrel countries of this world instead of aligning ourselves with our biggest trading partners. And if you look at trade with America, we're not only talking about AGOA and the huge negative effects of us possibly going to lose that, and we hope that we will not lose that. But there's a huge amount of other assistance that the United States of America is giving South Africa. Scholarships, other instances where they are promoting us. It's not only the trade and the aid that we're getting from them. That was perfectly described by Prof. William Gumede the other day that you and him and me was in a discussion. So we've got to promote and protect our own interests with regards to our agricultural sector, our manufacturing sector. But Adrian, whether SAI is the biggest or Agri-SA is the biggest or this person or organization speaks on behalf of South African farmers, that is not the relevant question here. What we've got to ask ourselves is that we must make sure that whoever is going to sit around a table and make decisions about South Africa must have the correct facts. We should not let emotions amplify the things that we've got here. We've got to have people that's reasonable and that will have the correct facts on the table when they make decisions. Because I can tell you now, if we are going to lose AGOA, as Johan said earlier on, it will be devastating for our farmers. If it's devastating to our farmers, it's devastating to the creation of jobs in our country. If we want to protect our country, we must make sure that we protect all trade relations. Try and build out on others, but do not do anything that will harm us in fostering proper trade relations with the largest economy in the world.
Billy, I do want to ask one question of you before I go to Carol, and that was Tembeka's point that we are talking about fears a lot today, but we are also we're not talking about what the majority of Black South Africans who haven't had the promise of land reform fulfilled since 1994, what they must think around this debate and around this act being enacted. What is the DA's position on land reform, and how you've got the Minister of Agriculture is one of yours, your party leader. I mean, what are you doing to assist in that regard?
Adrian, you'll remember that the high-level panel under the leadership of former President Kgalema Motlanthe that did the review on land reform said that it was not the Constitution or certain acts that stood in the way of proper land reform. He said that it was corruption in the ANC government at that stage that prevented land reform. If you go and you look at the land reform that took place in the DA-run Western Cape province, we are exceeding any other province in this country when it comes to the successful implementation of land reform. We used at that stage, current legislation, and we had no corruption in our processes, and we did it extremely successful. Land reform must take place. We all know that. But it must take place in a matter that you are not going to do that contra the Constitution. You must make sure that food security is not hampered at all. But it can be, and it has been done by the Democratic Alliance. People tend to again make a racial thing of this, white against black. It is not white against black. It is making sure that wrongs of the past are corrected, but in the right way. And in the Western Cape, it has been implemented without creating any havoc or any problems with the people there.
Thank you. Carol, can you come in on this point, please, and respond to what's been said around the fact that it should be the ANC that takes the blame for what Trump has done and for any repercussions, and that we shouldn't be pointing fingers at the likes of Solidarity, who's been feeding disinformation to Washington?
No, look, I think everybody has to take their fair share of responsibility. I do think that this has been, this particular issue has been hyped up by Solidarity and AfriForum. But at the same time, I do think that South Africa has believed that it could argue that it's non-aligned when in fact it wasn't really non-aligned. And this is the problem of the ANC, an organization with a history which has close ties with other countries in the world that are not the US, and which wants to remain true to that, and which really does want to be non-aligned. But in fact, you know, you can't be non-aligned if you're having war games with Russia, when, you know, Europe and America are at war with Russia over the Ukraine. So, you know, we've kind of ran out of road as far as that story goes. That story's worn a bit thin, that we are actually non-aligned. And actually, we're not non-aligned, for instance, when it comes to something like Israel and Palestine. I think if you asked most South Africans, are you glad that we as a country stood up for Palestine? I think many of them will say yes. We should, and we still should not turn our back on Palestine just because the US is saying we should. So we're in a complicated situation. We're not a simple, straightforward. We don't have a simple, straightforward relationship with the US. But that said, yeah, we could manage our relationships a lot better. I mean, India, for instance, manages to be friends with both sides quite easily.
We need to rethink our stance on our foreign policy. Carol Payton, thank you very much. I want to end, we're out of time. I want to end by asking each of you to maybe just tell us, if you were in President Cyril Ramaphosa's delegation to Washington, if you were in a boardroom with Donald Trump and his advisors, what would you tell Trump? Johan Kotze, starting with you.
So the first thing is South Africa. We farm all over South Africa. It's not an ANC problem. It's not a DA problem. It's a South African problem. And as South African farmers, now hear what Tembeka said, the white fear. There's no white fear. There is something far greater than that. There is, from us as farmers in South Africa, There's a fear that we lose the ability to farm in a proper way, to be self-sufficient to food in South Africa, because that's who we are. So my take would be, we have issues in South Africa, but this is not a racial issue. This is not a farm expropriation issue, although we're against the act. This is far greater than that. And I think as South Africans, we come such a far way from where we were up to where we are today. Do we still need to have a lot of work to be done? A lot of work needs to be done. I sense that as a farming community, black, white, small, large, commercial, non-commercial, there is a plan, and the plan is we farm. We take responsibility for what we can, and we take co-responsibility of the difficulties that we need to deal with in South Africa. I think the biggest, in my mind as a farmer, the biggest difficulty we have in South Africa is the mistrust. There's a trust deficit amongst us, and we need to work accordingly and make sure that we take up responsibility collectively, even though we differ as political parties or farming in different regions, and say, how can we collectively solve the issue of the South African community and for the greater South Africa?
Thank you. Tembeka, if you were on the delegation, what would you tell Trump?
Thank you. I do need to respond to Agri-SA because I honestly cannot understand how anyone can say that there is no race problem as far as land is concerned, as far as farming is concerned. When the statistics are that more than 70% of commercial agricultural land is owned by white people, and that Africans only own less than 5%. I honestly do think that we've got to be real when we're having these conversations. This is a matter of justice for many, many Africans that are sitting and watching this. And they're just astonished at the level of denial. What would I say to Trump? I would say two things. The first is that I would not sort of self-mutilate as the country. There is no reason to go into a war with America that we can never win. We can't win a trade war with America. We can't win a physical war with America. So we have to be diplomatically very smart. Secondly, we have matters of fundamental principle that we cannot change. We cannot change that we believe in the rule of law. And taking Israel to court was our affirmation of our belief in the rule of law. We also cannot change transformation. The fact that we're having a massive debate in this, which is where it should be. It should be on your platform, not at the White House. The fact that we're having a debate here about what the Constitution means shows again our commitment to constitutionalism. But it's not constitutionalism that is empty and abstract. It's transformative constitutionalism, because we're trying to redress 350 years of racial colonialism. So I would say to him, yes, we agree that the United States is our friend. We want them to be our friends. We would like them to assist us in our journey to fulfill our rule of law and to fulfill transformative constitutionalism.
Thank you very much, Tembeka Ngugai Toby. Jack Ferris, your last words.
Last words, I would echo what Temekile has said in terms of I was part of the delegation. I think it's ultimately, yes, South Africa needs the US from a trade perspective. Also, South Africa is a sovereign, independent state, and there are certain constitutional imperatives that needs to be dealt with. It has not been effectively dealt with over the past 30 years, and one of those are land reform. There's no need to be alarmist, and South Africa is working within a framework of international law and its own constitution, promoting the rule of law. But again, saying all of those things, you're dealing with people who are also irrational.
Well, thanks, Jack. Well, Willie Oukamp, if the DA, we know the DA is sending a delegation, so you may very well be in the room. What will you tell Trump?
Adrian, I think it's very important that President Trump must hear what we've said to the United States from the Democratic side, alliance side, over the past years, is that please do not punish all South Africans for the actions of the ANC. We said in previous delegations that we sent to the United States that South Africa is changing and there will be a change in our government. Last year we saw that. It is the ANC is not governing alone anymore. the ANC is governing in a government of national unity with us. So that would be the first thing that we will say, is please don't punish all South Africans for the inactions and wrongdoings of the ANC over many years. I would also urge our own president to listen more to his partners within the government of national unity. And I think the message that we must give the United States is that we are in this process of changing and rescuing South Africa. And if we are going to want to be a loyal and good ally to the United States, we need to grow our country. There's no use in saying we will be a good ally to anybody out there, but our country is falling apart internally. And what we would like to say to them is that if they want to have South Africa as a good ally, we must be strong in this country. We must have a growing economy. And by taking away trade and taking away aid to us will not assist us in being or growing into this strong economy. I would just like to add one thing to what Rebecca said, and that is, Rebecca, we know that you were the counsel in the ICJ case. And let's say what you're saying is right. Why did you not take the Russia on when they invaded Ukraine? So there's double standards, and I agree with what Carol says. It's people are asking us, why are you saying you are independent or you are neutral on stuff? And then in certain instances we act, in certain instances we don't act. And I think it's important to also show the United States, if we are in that room, that we will really protect not only our own interest, but the interest of the good people out there, Adrian.
Yeah. Look, I think it's unfair to ask the counsel of the client why they're not there. You should ask the client why they didn't take on Russia. I think
he answered all that.
And lastly, Carol Payton, if we can go to you, just what would you say? You said that South Africa should rather make other alliances, but if we are in the room with Trump, what should we tell him?
Look, I think it's going to be difficult to persuade him. I think that's part of the problem, because there are non-negotiables. You know, we can't negotiate on the principle of redress. We can't. And that's one of the things I think he wants. So I guess that one would have to try and say, look, you know, we are principled. I think our difficulty with that is that, as Willy's saying, we sometimes contradict our own principles. So I don't think it's going to be an easy discussion. And I would quite honestly say, yes, you go along. We should prostrate ourselves, say whatever we need to say. But better still to work on a global response, because I think that there are many people in the world today and many governments in many countries who are aghast at how Trump is attempting to rule the world and reshape the world order. And I think that we need to look for our place within that.
Well, I want to thank each of you for joining us today. This is we're out of time. This is way too short to discuss all of these issues. And in this year of the national dialogue, I commit that News24 will have more of these discussions on our platform. Thank you to our viewers and our readers for joining us today. Please keep the conversation going on news24.com. And thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Until next time, goodbye.